In the Fool's Play Discord, which you should join by the way, we have a section called Answered Rule Questions. In this channel, questions people have about the game that have been answered go to a read-only channel, where you can put a checkmark if you agree and an X if you don't. A ruling only becomes official if the majority of people agree, or if there's an official response from Circletoons. Having said that, the vast majority of answered rule questions are in favor of agreeing, even the strange ones. But there is one rule in there that not only has the most total reactions out of any other resolved question, but is a complete split, 10 to 10, in agreement and disagreement. This indecisiveness comes from how the Boots of Ceaseless Kicking works. The Boots of Ceaseless Kicking says you can discard any number of cards from your hand, gain +1 neutral strength for each card discarded during this combat. Overall, it's a pretty simple card. It gives you the ability to discard cards during combat to power yourself up. So, where does the division come in? Well, it's about how the statements are connected. Let's look back at the Answered Rule Questions channel. For Choa48, one of the admins for the server, posted, Boots of Ceaseless Kicking activates whenever you discard a card, even if you don't activate the effects of the boots. Also, you can discard cards when you are not in combat. So Fritch is making two statements here. The first, that the +1 strength part of the card activates when any card is discarded during combat, not just from the boots themselves. And two, that you can discard cards from your hand whenever you want. Both of these questions boil down to just one main question. Can the two abilities of this card work independently from one another? So is that true? Why do so many people disagree? In order to answer that, we need to look at the fundamentals of card games. Every card game begins with, well, a card. A standard layout for the most popular card games in the world is the card, then an image on top, and a text box on the bottom. Games that follow this standard are Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, One Piece, and Bible Battles. And although there are many card games that don't follow this exact layout, one thing all these equally popular card games have, and something we become so accustomed to and have taken for granted in language, is punctuation. For this case, we are specifically looking at periods. But this asks the question, what is a period? One of the oldest known records we have of punctuation comes from the Mesha Stele in the 9th century BC, a slab of basalt that confirms multiple conflicts that happened in the Hebrew Bible. On the slab, we see dots used to separate each word in the passage. The majority of text before this consisted mainly of written symbols like Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. As the time went on, alphabet-based writing continued to use the dots and dashes as the only forms of punctuation. On top of that, they also had no capitalization or vowels. This extremely basic form of textual language was acceptable for the time, as the main use for written word was keeping track of business deals. This was also why ancient societies used higher base counting systems, like the Sumerian base 60, as the main use for counting was also for business deals, dividing goods and calculating fractions. In the 2nd century BC, 700 years after the Mesha Stele was written, Aristophanes of Byzantium, who at the time was the head librarian at the Library of Alexandria, is credited with the creation of the first formal punctuation system. He created dots, known as theses, which were placed at different heights to indicate pauses when reading out loud, as reading socially and performatively was the cultural norm at the time. The highest of these dots was called the stigmateleia. Teleia? Stigmateleia, which translates to terminal dot or full stop. When the dot is placed at the end of a sentence, it is referred to as a periodos. The word is made up of the prefix peri, meaning around or about, and hodos, meaning path, way, or journey. So periodos, in punctuation, signifies the end of a complete thought, and the ending of a cycle of words. As centuries passed, medieval manuscripts gradually started changing from using a high dot to a low dot to improve readability as reading habits shifted from loud to silent. This version of the symbol stuck, being the standard version used in the first printing presses in the 1400s, and being standardized by grammarians in the 16th and 17th century. In British English, it became known as a full stop, and in American and Canadian English, as a period. Through that, we learn that a period signifies the end of a sentence and the completion of a statement, unlike a comma or a semicolon, which separate parts of a sentence but are still connected. We also learn that a grammarian is a thing, and that people genuinely spend their lives learning about grammar. Getting a hard on from having the authority to tell people that they're using their silly little lines and dots wrong has got to be the saddest thing I've heard in my life. Let's look back at the boots of ceaseless kicking. I'm not letting you forget this video is about Fool's Blade. Once again, it says, you can discard any number of cards from your hand, gain +1 neutral strength for each card discarded during this combat. With that very important context we can use the period in the middle to separate the cards into two individual statements. You can discard any number of cards from your hand, and gain +1 neutral strength for each card discarded during this combat. These are two completely separate statements, so they both work separately from one another, confirming Furch's post. This should be convincing enough, but I can show you examples of this inside the game. A perfect example is the Elemental Gear Trio, those being the Blood of the Great Dragon, Brine of the Abyss, and Sap of the First Tree. Let's take the Blood of the Great Dragon. It says, +1 fire strength. Against water monsters, all of your fire strength becomes neutral strength. With the period in the middle, we can once again divide these into two statements. So we have a +1 to fire strength, and against water monsters, all of your water strength becomes neutral strength. A period dividing two statements that, with the wording of the first and second part not directly referencing the other, act independently of one another. Because of this, it's very difficult to argue that you only get the +1 fire strength when you fight a water monster. That's mainly because of the period. We can use this exact same logic for the boots of ceaseless kicking. A period dividing two statements that, with the wording of the first and second part not directly referencing each other, act independently of one another. So, going back to our question from the beginning, can the two abilities on this card work independently from one another? I think it's safe to say that yes, they definitely can. Now that we've answered that, what can we do with it? Being able to discard a card at any time isn't really that useful. But where it gets really interesting is when you look at the second part. Boots of Ceaseless Kicking activates whenever any card is discarded during combat. Let's say you play Knife Toss and discard a blade part from your hand to gain +5 neutral strength. If you have the Boots of Ceaseless Kicking equipped, you'll also get the +1 strength from discarding the blade part, meaning you gain +6 neutral strength instead of +5 for no additional cost. Even crazier than that is when you realize that nowhere in the wording does it specify that you are the one who has to discard, just that a card is discarded. Let's take the inverse of the situation and say that someone plays Knife Toss on you and discards a blade part. The monster will gain +5 strength, but you'll also get +1 strength from their blade they discarded, meaning the monster only gets a net of 4 strength over you. This tech works for any situation where cards are discarded while the owner of the boots are in combat. That can be anything from action cards to class abilities to weapon part effects. This makes this card much stronger than most people realize. And to think you've been playing it wrong the whole time. If you could think of some additional situations this would be usable, please let me know in the comments. And while you're down there, you should click the link in the description and join the Fool's Blade Discord server. If you want to play Fool's Blade online with the community on the official Fool's Blade Tabletop Simulator mod, look at and create your own custom cards, and be the first to know about any and all Fool's Blade events and game updates, you should join the server. And if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe. This is my first video I've really poured my heart and soul into, and if this does well, I'll definitely keep making these. If you have any ideas for future videos, please let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.